Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. Again, as always, I am Katie Batesman, the Content Director at SheCanCode, and today the topic is excelling as a graduate in the world of machine learning. Now, a career in machine learning can be highly rewarding and offers numerous opportunities in various industries. While machine learning has gained significant popularity and is being increasingly embraced across various industries, there are still some misconceptions surrounding the field. Luckily, I've got the amazing Dana, who is working in software infrastructure for GraphCore in the field of machine learning, with me today to hear all about her role and why the field needs more diversity if it's going to progress. Welcome, Dana. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
Good. I'm so pleased to have you on, and we've got so much to get through today. So can we kick off with a little bit of background about yourself and how you got into tech and how you landed your role at GraphCore?
Yep, so I studied computer science at the University of Bristol. You know, when I started, it was kind of a long shot university I didn't necessarily expect to get into. And I found throughout my degree that I was actually a lot more capable than I'd kind of given myself credit for. And I learned a lot of new things I was good at. And kind of as I was coming to the end of my degree, I decided I was going to really try and do a dissertation on something I was quite interested in the research. And even if it was, I was a bit worried I wouldn't quite have the skill to bring it together. And that was quite a chaotic time because COVID hit kind of during my third year, and I did an integrated master's, so it was over 4 years. So very kind of chaotic end of my degree, but I ended up producing a piece of work and kind of small contribution to a very small aspect of research, but I was very proud of it. And I think that gave me that experience. I was going through it. I kind of looked around to see if there were roles in machine learning, especially in Bristol. And I'd heard of GraphCore, thought it was a bit of a long shot application, but I ended up kind of getting accepted onto a graduate scheme, which has been a really incredible experience. I guess my sort of university cohort had a bit of a strange experience because quite a few people weren't able to do internships kind of in your penultimate year because of COVID, which made that feeling of like breaking into industry feel a bit more burdensome because I was starting without any experience. I've found that kind of GraphCore's been a really positive environment. I've been able to meet a lot of people with a lot of different interests in the area. I found kind of software infrastructure, in particular software QA, is an area I really enjoy working in. And I have been able to learn a huge amount in quite a short amount of time, in about 2 years. And it's very different to learning at university, but it's been a really, really positive experience.
Yeah, it's so good to hear. We love hearing all of the different routes into tech on this podcast. And actually, you're one of the first people that I've heard who were hit by COVID while studying. I agree, because we've had some conversations on here actually about going into the world of work. It can be quite a baptism of fire. And obviously, if you're hit when you're still studying with COVID, by the time you reach work, it must have been kind of like, I don't know where to get started at this point. But going on to a graduate scheme, that must have really, really helped bridge that.
Yes, and I was very, very fortunate because I think it was September 2021, I started work. So it was a whole graduate scheme in Bristol. And it's quite a minor thing, but I'd lived in Bristol for a few years throughout my degree. At that point, there was a lot of people moving to Bristol. So I think we'd all had this kind of period of isolation. I mean, 2021, things were opening up a bit, but it felt like a really kind of good community, all at the kind of the same point in our careers. And a really interesting aspect of that was, particularly with what GraphCore does, is we had people at a lot of different aspects of the machine learning process. So we obviously have a lot of hardware and silicon engineers. It wasn't something I'd thought about particularly much because it just wasn't the area I'd studied. I'd spent a lot of my time in my degree kind of in the software space, and realizing kind of all the different parts, roles, and teams that go into making like a chip, like the IPU, was a really, really interesting experience. And one of the things I've really liked about working at GraphCore is that opportunity to kind of get a kind of look at everything, because of, I guess, that in bigger companies, it might be more difficult to feel like you're able to get like a total view of everything because it's just so big, so many people. But like within GraphCore, I've been able to learn a huge amount from a huge amount of people who are experts in their respective fields. And I feel very lucky for the opportunity.
And I think a lot of our listeners are wondering as well, what is life like at GraphCore? What is your role and what is your day-to-day like?
So I am a test tools engineer under the software QA team.
Super cool role, by the way.
Well, it's a really interesting one. So within the whole company, we produce the IPU, and what a lot of the software team focuses on is the popular SDK, the kind of development kit that's going to basically enable AI developers to use the IPU to get that performance out of the chip. So we have this development kit with a lot of different components going into it. So obviously we have Poplar, the kind of base graph language the IPU is running off, but also our framework implementations in terms of things like PyTorch and TensorFlow. We want to make sure that like people who are doing machine learning, who are doing AI, are able to kind of use the frameworks they're familiar with on the IPU. So there's a lot of different aspects in the SDK, and there's a lot of different people working on it, which means that, a lot of changes go into it, which means it's really important to keep track on how is it doing at the jobs? Is it getting faster? Is it getting slower? So a large part of what our team does is kind of runs a series of tests overnight and kind of develops the infrastructure for the running of these tests and collecting of results, and tries to make assessments of basically have changes been made in the SDK that have had unforeseen consequences, which are going to result in lower performance, because obviously, every change someone makes is going towards the aim of being faster, which is going to enable people to learn faster, because so much of machine learning is at scale. If you have a 60-day training time, then even a 5% reduction is the best part of a week. I haven't thought about the numbers of that. It's a huge impact. So performance is a really important aspect of it. My role is kind of working, I guess, in roughly half is kind of developing the infrastructure for the running of these tests, for the storing of data, and the kind of automation of a lot of these processes. And kind of another half is working internally with teams, kind of liaising with development teams who've made changes which have maybe had unforeseen consequences, working with the teams which kind of develop our front-facing models, our paper-based notebooks, but all the various aspects that go into running a test, but what a customer is going to potentially experience running a test. Our team is trying to make sure they have the best, fastest, and kind of most reliable experience possible, which is a really interesting challenge. It is an ongoing process. It is this kind of sort of changes are going in every day, changes are being made to the SDK every day, and it's really important that we aren't accidentally resulting in lower performance, because that's obviously not going to be really useful to anyone. So there are aspects of it which are challenging, but also I think I really enjoy the kind of dynamicism of it, where kind of every day you're kind of presented with new challenges. Every day there's new problems to solve. It has a real sense of kind of progression, and also as we're seeing more and more models be developed by our AI engineering teams, you also kind of get a sense of, from a very specific perspective, but you also see the changes in landscapes of AI models, because where AI and machine learning is as a field is that, there are shifts occurring on 1 to 2 year timeframes. Models are rising and falling in popularity. Frameworks are rising and falling in popularity. It's a very dynamic thing. So it's a very exciting time to be in machine learning.
Yeah, you know what, Dana, everything you just said was highly technical. What I'm wondering is, did you know when you graduated, did you know that you would have such involvement in everything that you do at GraphCore? Because it sounds like you have such responsibility.
Well,
would you have that at other companies as well? Is it just their culture? What is it?
So I think the thing is, at bigger companies with kind of more established processes, it's very difficult to get that kind of same overview of everything. So you definitely might, it's not necessarily that you wouldn't get that kind of responsibility or agency in an area, but I think where GraphCore is as a company, the kind of rate at which things are moving, it feels that the focus is on moving fast, moving effectively, and moving efficiently, in a way that means that if you have the kind of mindset that you're able to like stand up and get involved, you will find that you are able to contribute. And I think one of the big things I felt while leaving university was that I was like, well, when you're doing university assessments, you're focused on, a very, very specific point. Make this part of this software cycle work really well, and there's a grading scheme, and you know how well, if you do this, you'll get this result. Whereas at companies, things are a lot more nebulous. People work in a very different way. And I think I had this feeling that I was leaving university, particularly with the disruption COVID presented, with a kind of very student mindset. And I guess the fear that like I wouldn't necessarily be able to keep up in an environment that I wouldn't have necessarily like technical skill, that I wouldn't necessarily fit in the culture. It was something I was quite nervous about. And I found very quickly that actually you can contribute. And I think that's one thing I would want to like really emphasize, because it really was so different to how I felt at the point of leaving university. But actually,
Yeah.
I mean, with a good attitude, with an openness to learning, you will find that there is a strong percentage of things that you are able to do out of the door. You'll find there is a pretty big percentage of things you can pick up quite quickly, and the things which are more difficult, you will have the support and environment to assist you in learning. So yeah, no, I definitely didn't expect it. I was slightly worried with, I guess, the pressure that presented, because there's a case to be made that in a kind of other setup, if you've got more structure, if you're staying in a 2-year very structured graduate scheme, that's more of a kind of literal transition period between university and work. But I haven't had that as much, but I felt that's benefited me quite well. I felt I've been able to kind of jump in full force. And I think one of the things that I was most surprised in that respect is I was almost worried that if I were to have a conversation with someone who had a huge amount of knowledge or depth in one area, but I wouldn't even know the right words to ask them an interesting question. And I think I've been surprised how much I've been able to learn by people, and how much people have kind of valued my perspective and input for things, even though part of me still feels like I'm in my first year of university. But actually, no, I have learned a lot, I have developed a lot, and it all happens so quickly you don't even notice it's happening.
Yeah, and I'm pleased you said that the way that you were thinking about coming into your first job, and what you thought that was going to be, and what people were going to be like, you being very new in technology. Because I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on the tech sector before you joined it, and whether there are any barriers to starting in tech. You mentioned there about just sometimes just worrying that you won't even know the words and the questions to ask people, and it's a learning curve for everybody, isn't it? But did you find other barriers like that might have put you off the tech sector?
I mean, definitely. I think there was a sense. I remember there were points in university where I felt like that the kind of culture of the people who were really good or really passionate, I just didn't necessarily feel aligned by. Obviously, as a trans woman, I have been spared some of the many cultural barriers that a lot of women face in trying to enter the tech sector, but have also had experiences of, kind of general misogyny, and more just a sense of that there is a type of person that this space is for, and it's difficult to fit in with that. And inside, I think, not even this company, specifically inside companies, I think it often is very different. Though those problems do exist and do require conscious thought and dealing with, often the spaces themselves, the people within them are nice, and people do care about making things better. So, I mean, yeah, in terms of the barriers, I think there was a sense of there is a very strong projection culturally that there is a certain type of person for whom the world of technology is for. And I think this kind of narrative emerges that you need to be the absolute best of the best, the 10x engineer, have mastered every single programming language around to contribute. Whereas, and those are really important skills, and you will meet people who have many of them. But actually, teams are made up of people with lots of different skills. And I think dismantling that idea of what an engineer looks like is really, really important. A huge amount of the engineers I work with do not kind of speak like, how a lot of people tell you all engineers are like. And I think, there can be, I think, a stereotype of people think of engineers as often kind of white nerdy men, and that's obviously, oh well, that's a negative stereotype, but that still creates in it a huge kind of, this space is for the white nerdy men, whereas it isn't. Technology affects all of our lives, and I think with acceleration AI will continue to affect all of our lives. It is really important that we make space in tech to have as many people's perspective as possible, as many people's ideas as possible. So I think it's really, there are those very real, very material barriers on both the kind of micro and macro scale, which can make it really difficult to get your foot in the door initially with tech. And unfortunately, there isn't an easy solution to a lot of those, and it would be fantastic if there was. But within the company, I think, women's engineering networks are a lot stronger than I imagined they would be before I was joining, because I think that community still does build up. So there are those very real, very material barriers that can make it really difficult to kind of get your foot in the door. But there are a lot of organizations which are committed to kind of opening accessibility, and companies themselves understand that everyone benefits from diverse perspectives, particularly in machine learning and AI. But it is very important to kind of double underline and be clear.
Yes, definitely. And you know, going back to your first point as well on just what people think of the tech industry, and we have live webinars, and a lot of our questions from our community are normally about how technical do I have to be? Do I have to have really technical skills? And people really worry that they're going to come in and they're not going to know. They're not going to fit into the box of what they think an engineer is. They're not going to have as much technical knowledge as they think they need. And then they get in here and then they realize, actually, when they talk to their colleagues, not everybody has a technical background, or you might work with, you know, yourself might have a technical background, but you might work with lots of team members within technology who don't, and they have lots of wonderful soft skills as well. And as a team, you all function to put together a fantastic product. But yeah, I think it's that misconception. As you said, you have to be a certain type of person with a certain type of skills, and it puts a lot of people off.
I think there's a tendency to undervalue soft skills, but I think actually being able to communicate technical ideas efficiently to relevant stakeholders is a really useful skill. I would dare posit a conjecture that, like, I think being really, really technical and being able to filter out the relevant parts in speaking to someone are often inversely correlated. That's not a bad thing. Having people with different skills together on the team is, I think, what makes teams work well and effectively. In the way we talk about the narrative of tech, we really like to have these narratives of the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs and the Jeff Bezoses and this one person who makes it happen. That is categorically untrue. Not in the sense that actually Steve Wozniak acted a lot too. A huge amount of people whose names have been lost to history did a massive amount. A huge amount of those people were women, a huge amount of those people were people of color, and a huge amount of those people were queer. It's really important, I think, we move away from this idea that there is a star of the show who is, you know, the person doing all the code, when actually it's all the different things come together. And in the context of machine learning, it's also effective and efficient deployment and productionization of things. So yeah, there's two aspects to it. One, there is a need for a range of skills, and being not super technical is not a barrier. However, I do also think it is massively true that women in tech will probably have a more general tendency to underestimate their kind of how proficient they think they are. Yes. So it isn't just that you don't need technical skills, but also technical skills is a loose thing. It's a thing you can learn. It's a thing you can pick up from. I want to highlight that range of skills is really important.
Yeah, and like yourself as well, if you get into the right company that encourages you to continue to learn, you get in, you know, whether it's a good graduate scheme, apprenticeship, whatever it may be, then sometimes it's just landing on your feet as well in the right company that moves you forward in the direction that you wanted to go in.
Or with the right person who's willing to mentor you, who's willing to connect with you in that way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit about you have not freedom, I'm assuming you have to answer to bosses, but can you tell us a little bit about the benefits of working in an environment where you're trusted so early on in your career, to, you know, your team knows that you're good at what you do? How does that support you mentally with your confidence and moving forward to achieve your goals?
Oh, massively. I think there's a ton of different aspects to this, but number one is the sense that, you know, I, like a huge amount of other people, especially women in tech, and walked in the door with a sense of, I am secretly bad at code. Everyone else here is good at code, and it's only a matter of time until they find out.
They find me out. Yes. Oh gosh. Yes, the imposter syndrome. Yeah.
Exactly. And then actually, you start to erode that. You know, it doesn't necessarily go away completely, because I think that's a mental process that maybe is sometimes useful. Not all the time, and definitely not all the time. So I think it's definitely a sense of developing confidence, I found as I felt more confident, I felt a lot more able to manage stress. I felt a lot more able to make kind of effective estimates of my capabilities. which has been, yeah, it's been a thing of, I think, people placing trust in you. I mean, it's wildly different to the other job I've worked for most of the time of my life was at a supermarket. I'm given a lot more faith here, and I'm able
Yeah.
to go a lot further with it.
Yes.
One aspect of it is, I think, being given a bit of flexibility can really help. If I'm not feeling particularly well, or if I need to, I've been able to be involved more in volunteering things than I would have in potentially other roles, because I know I'm going to have that support if I need to move an hour or two about here or there. One aspect which is also relevant. So I'm neurodivergent. I've got autism and ADHD. It just works really well for me in a way that I feel a huge amount of structure wouldn't necessarily. So I feel a lot more able to kind of, knowing myself, especially it feels like in my dissertation, I learned a lot of I know how I work best, but I'm kind of given the freedom to work best myself. And it means that my mental energy can go into doing my tasks, working with my team, and not, the stressful sense of, am I doing the right thing, or feeling stressed. If I was worrying about things all the day, I wouldn't get anything done, not for lack of trying. That's just how the human brain works. Yeah. So I feel the biggest thing is that if you are given a bit of space, you are trusted to know how know what works best for you, because everyone knows what works best for themselves. And I think a little bit of freedom is often much more useful than a very structured system that makes assumptions about how someone is, how someone works. Something that's just a bit more forgiving, a bit more flexible, I think can make a huge difference. And for me, definitely has. It's been a really, confidence boosting thing, but also it has made me feel, almost like I was saying previously, like I belong in a way I definitely didn't imagine thinking at this point in my career.
Yeah, because good companies, they know how to retain good talent, don't they? And like you said, if you find yourself in an environment where you feel like you don't belong and you stress most of the day, it's only a matter of time either before you're pushed or you find a way out of the business. I mean, that's the two things that are going to happen then.
It's not sustainable, and I think that's the thing. A level of work or productivity maintained by stress is not sustainable. And a company that's trying to produce that, not in a sort of short burst sense, but in a long-term sense, is not a company that's thinking, that's thinking the right way about looking after its employees.
Yes.
I mean, I'm saying that with a lot of confidence for a 24-year-old who's never had any management experience ever, but
You're doing okay so far. You spoke a little bit about networks and support groups, and sometimes that as well is just sharing your stories with other people and hearing that other people feel the same way that you do. Are there any communities or groups that you've worked with recently? And obviously these can be whether they're internal groups or external groups that you work with.
Yeah, so I mean, it's mostly in the, as I was saying before, volunteering sense, and I feel I get quite supported in basically making decisions in managing my time and being able to move things around. So I've been kind of past few months involved in a scheme through the university where it's sort of with mentoring sort of younger trans sort of first or second years, which has been really, really positive. Because I think that's also an aspect you don't necessarily consider when you're a student, but when you're working, I think you need things like volunteering, however that is for you. I think that's a really important part of kind of keeping balance. And I think companies, I really appreciate working in a company that understands that. So I've just started doing a couple of things with the Bristol Autistic Society, which is kind of very much, as you said, kind of speaking particularly as my experience as a trans and neurodivergent person, which is a really cool thing. And it's been really good to be supported by kind of my managers in that.
Giving you the time to just think, what, I can give back, and you don't have to worry about you're doing something wrong at work or anything.
Exactly.
Take that time, do what you need.
I think it's the thing of okay, I will be out for an hour and I will, make it up at some other point, but we don't have to worry about, mapping hour to hour as much as it's about, how am I doing? How are my contributions to the team? And I think that is that feels like a much more logical metric to kind of go by. Internally, there's sort of a women's network at GraphCore, which is really, really lovely, a really kind of strong community of people. A sort of queer LGBT network, which is a really nice group. And I also, The trans network is quite a strong phrase for a single digit number of people, but sort of within the trans people at GraphCore, I think we do have quite a strong sense of community and like
Yeah.
looking out for each other. And I think that's the thing. For a first job, you don't, when you're a student, you kind of meet people who are your exact age, the exact level of experience of you. Whereas going to company, you meet people huge, as you're saying at the very start, it feels like everyone takes a slightly different path to get into tech. And I think learning from people's different experiences is such a sort of, it's such an enriching thing, because I think it just really instills in you an appreciation for kind of teams with diverse perspectives, diverse approaches, because those are the teams in which I think you can get some really interesting problem solving done, but also learn. It's, I think, quite difficult to learn in a situation where everyone thinks the same way as you, because
Yes.
I think
You
the
keep
danger
making the same mistakes.
exactly, and you will, pat yourselves on the back as the Titanic sinks, and suddenly the problem, you don't actually get challenged in that way that is conducive to learning. And also, this isn't really in response to the question, but it's also, I guess, worth mentioning. But like being in places that have explicit ways of handling kind of, having a culture of kind of clear, direct feedback in a way that's kind of not harsh or mean is a really positive thing for me. I really benefit from kind of getting feedback. And I think one of the best things about being someone who is just starting off in your career is everyone has something to teach you. So I try to take advantage of that as much as possible.
Yes, actually, you know what? I had a conversation about that yesterday, funny enough, about feedback, because the way that you give feedback to people is so important. I mean, and it changes constantly as well. And the conversation yesterday was, we have to keep looking at how we give feedback and when we grow as a company, because the way that you would give feedback to somebody as a company of 10 is very different to how you would feedback to employees of 600. So, and it can really crush somebody or lift somebody depending on how, you feedback to them on what they've done. But like you said, you've got the right attitude there. Everything you're learning is new. So, all feedback is good at this moment in time. In terms of feedback learning, obviously learning new things, what learning opportunities have GraphCore offered you so far, and how have these helped you to grow professionally?
So so GraphCore does like engage with a learning platform which offers some really useful things. But I think the thing, I guess particularly with where machine learning is as a field, has been like proximity to people who are, who have a huge amount of range and experience. I left university feeling like I really kind of knew what I was talking about on one very, very, very specific region of machine learning. And going to work, you realize, you don't quite as much as you think, but also people have this experience over so much more. So I think the thing that's helped me most it's almost not a company thing as much. It's something which I didn't realize necessarily before I started, which is a generally true maxim. Engineers generally quite enjoy telling you what they're working on, especially if you're interested. You can just go around and ask someone, what are you working on? What's that aspect? And I think that because of the culture cultivated at GraphCore, I think it is a culture where people are very, very willing to share knowledge, and also, I guess, like integration within the sort of wider research community and being part of that discussion. And kind of, I think it's something I found, at least before starting work, was it was very difficult for me to imagine what like a big company would be like. How do all those individual actors come together and direct their efforts? And I think a huge part of the learning for me has just been, how does it work at scale? How do you bring together all these very, very clever people, very, very passionate people, and channel it? And I think not only have I been able to learn from the people individually, but also kind of from the organization. And the culture is a huge, huge part of that.
Dana, I wanted to ask you, for our listeners who might be considering a career in machine learning, do you have any advice for them? Is there anything you wish somebody had told you?
Yes. Yeah. I think one thing I really, really, really want to emphasize, you are more capable than you think, categorically. I think it is really easy to end up in this, in thinking that like you might not necessarily have the skills, or there's things you might not be as good at. I mean, there is a very decent chance you are much more capable than you think. You likely have a lot more to contribute than you think that you could start to play with, and your perspective is valuable. I think that is the main thing, is don't let this idea that you need to be a certain type of person with a certain type of expertise to succeed in tech prevent you from, engaging with it if it's something you're passionate about, because passion is really important. We were saying earlier about the importance of soft skills, and it's very true in engineering that very often it is better to have a team of kind of passionate people working together on a goal than a number of very, very technical engineers who struggle to work together as a team. Don't be intimidated by jargon, particularly in terms of reading research papers, in that a lot of them are unfortunately, your first time looking at it, it might seem a little incomprehensible because so much of it is hidden and obscured behind jargon. That is frustrating because I think jargon can obscure what could be interesting conversations and limits who's able to participate in them. So I would say don't let that intimidate you. If you are passionate about machine learning, dive into the papers, get your head around things, ask questions if you can, ask questions if you've got support. Feel free to start practicing, start implementing things, start working on them. I think that is the biggest thing I would emphasize. Cutting edge is not a physical place separate to all other forms of technology. You do not have to be the greatest engineer in the world to contribute to AI. You can do that on an individual basis, you can do that in a company, but I guess the thing I would emphasize is, particularly if you have a perspective historically underrepresented in tech circles, that perspective is valuable. If you feel that, you're just not good enough or don't know enough, cut yourself a break. Consider ways you can develop and kind of practice those skills, and don't see it as an impossible thing, because I guarantee you, I did not imagine that I would ever be able to work in a machine learning field. And if it makes you feel any better, on the first day of my first internship a few years ago, which wasn't at Graphic, it was at a different company, I walked into a glass door twice. And I definitely didn't feel I was made for the world of tech in that moment. But I made it here and no one's kicked me out yet.
Yes, amazing. Well, that is lovely advice. I think everybody working in tech or thinking of moving into tech should hear that advice, because you are absolutely right. We all do have those moments where we just think, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And also from this conversation, I think it has all been down to as well finding a really good company that really supports you and can make such a difference to your working life. But Dana, we're already out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. So I've absolutely loved having you on the podcast, so thank you so much. Thank you. And to everybody listening, as always, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time.